The Georgia heat was already building at 0700 as Rebecca Torres pulled her beat-up Ford Ranger into the parking space at Fort Hartwell Supply Depot. At 52, she moved with the measured precision of someone who'd spent decades in military environments, though the slight limp in her right leg betrayed the eye blast that had ended her career 8 years ago. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun out of habit, and her civilian clothes were pressed and organized with the kind of attention to detail that never really leaves a soldier. She wasn't here to prove anything. The email had been straightforward. Civilian contractor needed for weekend training exercise. Military logistics experience preferred. No pay. Meals provided. Between jobs and tired of staring at her apartment walls, Rebecca had volunteered. Simple as that. The Supply Depot buzzed with Monday morning energy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between stacks of MREs and folded equipment. The air carried that distinctive military smell of canvas, disinfectant, and industrial-strength coffee. Behind the counter, a young private named Collins pegged nervously at his computer terminal, while two specialists debated boot brands near the uniform racks. But it was her jacket that drew the stares. The faded green field jacket had seen better decades. Sun-bleached from multiple deployments, the fabric was worn thin at the cuffs and shoulders. The unit patch on her left arm was so faded it was barely visible, just ghost threads and fabric shadows where something significant used to be. Most people wouldn't give it a second look, but this was a military base where details mattered and uniforms told stories. "Halloween's not for another few months," came a voice from behind her. Rebecca turned to see 3 second lieutenants clustered near the boot rack, their pressed uniforms and shiny bars screaming fresh out of officer school. The tall one-name tape, reading Myers, had that particular swagger that came with new rank and zero real-world experience. "Look at that jacket," whispered Lieutenant Bradley, not bothering to lower his voice. "Goodwill special, you think?" The third officer, Lieutenant Torres, shook his head with theatrical sympathy. Probably found it in her grandfather's attic. "You know how these people are, put on some old uniform, and suddenly they're war heroes." Rebecca continued walking, grabbing what she needed from the shelves. Size 8 boots, hydration pack, work gloves. Her movements were economical, practiced, no wasted motion. Behind her, the commentary continued. "Some people just can't let go," Myers said loud enough to be heard 3 aisles over. "Probably tells war stories at the VFW about missions that never happened. Secret operations in countries that don't exist," Bradley added, warming to the theme. "I bet she's got a whole closet full of fake patches and made-up ribbons." They were enjoying themselves now, feeding off each other's confidence. This was safe territory, punching down at someone who couldn't punch back. The perfect Monday morning entertainment. Rebecca approached the checkout counter where Private Collins waited, looking nervous. "Morning, ma'am. Got your paperwork." She handed over her authorization letter, 3 pages, properly formatted, signed by a battalion logistics officer with enough stamps to choke a bureaucrat. Collins read it twice, frowned at his screen, then tapped keys with increasing desperation. System says you need active duty clearance or assigned unit code," he stammered. "Still showing manual approval required. I might need to get my supervisor, but he's at morning briefing." That's when Lieutenant Myers decided to be helpful. He strolled over with that practiced grin officers use when they think they've caught someone in a lie. "Let me take a look at that," he said, reaching for the paperwork with casual authority. "Pretty convincing, but here's the thing, we get people trying this all the time. Fake authorization letters, expired waivers. Anyone with a computer can make something that looks official." Private Collins shifted uncomfortably, caught between regulations and rank. "Ma'am, you might need to come back once it's been cleared." Through the battalion office, Rebecca nodded once, no argument, no protest. She simply stepped aside and sat down on the metal bench against the wall, setting her gear list on her knee like she had all the time in the world. As she settled in, Lieutenant Bradley walked past slowly, making sure his voice carried. Maybe try a uniform that actually fits next time. There are regulations about proper appearance, even for civilians. Rebecca kept her eyes forward, ignoring the laughter that followed. But for just a moment, as she adjusted her bag, her jacket shifted enough to reveal more of that faded patch on her shoulder. A civilian contractor rolling ammunition crates nearby stopped mid-stride when he caught sight of it. His eyes went wide for just a second, like he'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Then he turned and disappeared into the back storage room, moving faster than his job required. Rebecca barely noticed. She was used to waiting. But across the room, someone else had been watching. Someone whose presence would change everything. In the next few minutes, the morning was about to get very interesting. The lieutenants had found themselves an audience. Word spreads fast on military bases, especially when junior officers think they've caught someone in stolen valor. 2 more officers and a supply want had gathered around as Lieutenant Bradley held court, one boot propped against a chair like he was delivering a lecture. I'm telling you, they crawl out every time there's a military documentary on cable, he said, gesturing with his energy drink. Probably thinks she's starring in her own war movie. Safe, comfortable laughter rippled through the group. They were in their element now, rank protecting them, regulations backing them up, superior knowledge assumed. You see that patch? Myers added, warming to his theme. So faded you can't even tell what it used to be. Bet she's got stories about classified missions nobody can verify. The warrant officer, a guy named Patterson, who should have known better after 15 years in the Army, shook his head with theatrical sympathy. They always flash a scar and wait for someone to buy them a beer. That patch doesn't even show up in any database I know. Rebecca remained on the bench, appearing to study her paperwork while every word carried across the depot's acoustic-friendly concrete floors. Her jaw stayed relaxed, her breathing steady, but something had shifted in her posture. Not tense exactly, more like someone who'd heard a familiar sound in the distance and was calculating range and direction. The best part, Bradley continued, really getting into it now, is how they never give you details. It's always classified or need to know, or my personal favorite. If I told you, I'd have to kill you, because who's going to challenge? That? More laughter. Behind the counter, Private Collins kept glancing nervously between his computer screen and the growing crowd of officers. This wasn't his first day, but it might be his most complicated one yet. I had a guy in my ROTC class who pulled the same thing, Patterson said. Claimed his dad was Special Forces, showed up to military ball wearing ribbons that didn't exist. Turns out the old man drove trucks in the motor pool. They always count on the silence, Bradley said, really hitting his stride now. Because confronting them makes you look like the bad guy. So they just sit there with their fake patches and made-up stories, waiting for someone to thank them for their service. What they didn't notice was the man who'd entered the depot 5 minutes earlier. He moved with the kind of stillness that made smart people stop talking and dumb people keep going. Combat-seasoned OCPs that had seen real use, not parade ground pressing. Sleeves rolled to show deployment tattoos that went up his arm like a timeline of places most people couldn't find on a map. His name tape read Reynolds in faded black letters. The one below it read Brig Gen. Brigadier General Marcus Reynolds. Had been at Fort Hartwell for exactly 6 months, transferred in from Joint Special Operations Command, after what the papers called a distinguished career in unconventional warfare. What the papers didn't mention were the operations that never made it into official records, the units that existed in the shadows between what Congress knew and what needed to be done. He'd stopped by the depot to check on equipment for next week's training exercise, but something had caught his attention. Not the laughter. He'd heard enough junior officers practicing their superiority to recognize the sound. It was something else. Something about the woman on the bench that made him take a second look. That's when he saw the patch, or rather, what was left of it. Those threads and fabric shadows were something significant used to be. Most people would dismiss it as standard wear and tear, but Reynolds had spent enough time in classified briefings to recognize the signs of intentional obscurity. Some patches were meant to fade. Some units were designed to disappear. He walked closer, studying the outline with the practiced eye of someone who'd read files that weren't supposed to exist. The shape was familiar not from any regulation manual, but from memories he kept locked away in compartmentalized sections of his mind. "Excuse me," he said quietly, approaching the bench. Rebecca looked up, and for just a moment, their eyes met with the kind of recognition that happens between people who've seen things others haven't. She didn't salute. She was civilian now, but something in her posture acknowledged his rank. "That patch on your shoulder," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Where do you serve with the 158th? The depot went quiet. Not just their conversation, but everything. The lieutenant stopped mid-sentence. Private Collins froze with his hand on the scanner. Even the forklift in the back stopped beeping. Rebecca's answer was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden silence, everyone heard it clearly. Echo Response Group. Started with them during Operation Nightfall. Finished on Crimson Ridge. The names meant nothing to the lieutenant still. Frozen by the vending machines. They were just words operation codes that might as well have been random letters. But to General Reynolds, they were coordinates on a map drawn in blood and classified ink. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. Around them, the depot held its collective breath. Echo Response didn't have a public roster, he said, his voice dropping to something almost reverent. Most people think it never existed. Hell, most people in the Pentagon think it never existed. Rebecca met his eyes directly now, measuring him the way someone measures distance to a target. It existed for 7 years. Then half of us got folded into phantom units. The rest were debriefed into silence. A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but loaded with the weight of shared understanding between people who'd seen things that didn't make it into official reports. Behind them, Lieutenant Myers whispered something that sounded like a question, but nobody answered because the air itself felt heavy with implications they didn't understand. General Reynolds was about to make this morning unforgettable for everyone involved. The silence stretched like a held breath. General Reynolds stepped closer to Rebecca, close enough that his shadow fell across her shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that saved lives or ended them. "Crimson Ridge," he said, almost to himself. "October 2011. We called it Operation Ghost Walker in the public files." "That wasn't the real name," Rebecca replied quietly. "No, it wasn't." Lieutenant Myers found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Sir, is there a problem here?" Reynolds turned toward the group of officers with the slow, deliberate movement of a predator sizing up prey. The smile that spread across his face held no warmth whatsoever. "Problem?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the recycled air. "No, Lieutenant. No problem at all. Just having a conversation with someone who saved my life." The words hit the depot like a physical force. Myers' face went pale. Bradley actually took a step backward. Even Patterson, with his 15 years of experience, looked like he wanted to find the nearest exit. "Sir," Bradley stammered, "we were JUST, the authorization looked." "What did it look like, Lieutenant?" Reynolds' voice cut through the excuse like a blade through paper. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a properly formatted requisition signed by a battalion logistics officer. What did you see that I'm missing? Bradley's mouth opened and closed without sound. Behind him, Myers was studying the floor tiles like they contained the secrets of the universe. Reynolds wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, the kind of movement that suggested serious consequences were about to unfold. Sergeant Major Williams? It's Reynolds. I need you down at the supply depot immediately. We have what you might call an educational opportunity for some of your junior officers. The call ended. The depot remained silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of someone's career possibly ending. Here's what's going to happen, Reynolds said, his voice carrying across the room with parade ground authority. Sergeant. First Class Torres, and yes, that's her rank. Even in retirement is going to get her equipment. She's going to get it with full honors and complete respect. And then we're all going to have a conversation about the difference between stolen valor and classified operations that saved American lives. Rebecca stood slowly from the bench, her movement fluid despite the old injury. For the first time that morning, she looked directly at the 3 lieutenants who'd been providing commentary on her appearance. You didn't ask, she said simply. 2 words that carried more weight than any lecture. Myers stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back in a futile attempt at military bearing. Ma'am, I want to apologize. We didn't realize. You didn't ask, she repeated, not letting him off the hook. You saw something you didn't understand and decided you knew the story. The depot doors hissed open, and Sergeant Major Williams entered like a force of nature. 28 years in the Army had given him the kind of presence that made grown soldiers check their bootlaces and junior officers question their life choices. His eyes swept the scene, taking in the frozen officers, the civilian woman standing calmly in the center of it all, and his general wearing an expression that suggested someone was about to receive an education they'd never forget. Sergeant Major, Reynolds said without preamble, meet Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres, formerly of the 158th Echo Response Group. She's here on authorized business and has been waiting. He checked his watch. 47 minutes for equipment that should have been issued without question. William's eyes immediately went to Rebecca's shoulder, studying the faded patch outline with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen enough classified briefings to recognize the signs. Something shifted in his expression, not recognition of her personally, but of something he'd only heard whispered about in secured conference rooms. Echo Response ran triple black protocol, Reynolds continued, his voice carrying across the now silent depot. Minimal records, 0 press coverage, complete operational deniability. But I know it existed because on October 15th, 2011, outside Kandahar, when my convoy lost air support and got pinned down in a kill box with wounded personnel and no extraction. Possible? Echo Response went without backup, without authorization, and gave us the opening we needed to reach the landing zone. He looked directly at Rebecca. They drew fire away from our position. 57 personnel made it home because someone was willing to run an operation that officially never happened. The weight of those words settled over the depot like a physical thing. Private Collins stood behind his counter, looking like he'd witnessed history being rewritten in real time. The 3 lieutenants appeared to be experiencing what military professionals call a career-defining moment, and not in a good way. Sergeant Major Williams straightened to attention. Ma'am, he said to Rebecca, it would be my honor to personally ensure you receive everything you need. No forms, no waiting, no questions. I appreciate that, Sergeant Major, Rebecca replied, her voice steady. But the forms are fine. I just need someone to process them. Williams nodded and headed directly for the counter, where Private Collins was frantically hitting override codes like his life depended on it. General Reynolds wasn't finished with the education session. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the three officers with the tone normally reserved for addressing subordinates who just made career-ending mistakes, "let me share something with you about assumptions. When you see someone wearing a faded uniform, patch you don't recognize, you have two choices. You can ask respectfully, or you can make jokes. Today, you chose poorly." The lesson was just beginning. General Reynolds positioned himself between the three lieutenants and the rest of the depot, creating what military professionals recognize as a teaching moment, the kind that gets remembered for entire careers and passed down through unit. "Folklore. Lieutenant Myers," he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of authority that makes grown adults wish they could disappear. "Tell me about your military experience." Myers straightened, trying to salvage some dignity from a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. "Sir, I graduated from West Point 18 months ago. Completed officer basic course, advanced individual training, and..." "How many combat operations have you led?" Reynolds interrupted. "Sir, I haven't deployed yet, but how many soldiers have you been responsible for in a hostile environment?" "None, sir, but my training. Lieutenant Bradley." Reynolds turned without giving Myers a chance to finish. "Same questions." Bradley's confidence had evaporated completely. "Sir, I'm fresh out of ROTC. This is my first assignment." "And Lieutenant Tor is no relation, I assume," Reynolds said, glancing at Rebecca with something that might have been amusement. "Your combat experience?" "None, sir," Torres admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "So let me understand this correctly," Reynolds continued, pacing slowly in front of them like a professor delivering a lecture on military history. Three officers with a combined total of 0 combat experience, 0 deployments, and 0 soldiers, under their command in hostile territory, decided to mock a veteran whose unit patch you couldn't identify. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people acutely aware of their own heartbeat. Behind the counter, Private Collins had successfully processed Rebecca's authorization and was now loading gear onto a hand truck with the kind of focused attention normally reserved for handling live explosives. Sergeant Major Williams supervised, ensuring everything was regulation perfect. "Here's what you don't understand," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to the tone he probably used in classified briefings. "Some units in the United States military operate outside normal command structures. Some operations happen in places that don't exist on maps, against enemies that aren't acknowledged in public reports, using methods that would never survive. Congressional oversight." He paused, letting that sink in. "These operations are staffed by volunteers who understand that their service will never be publicly recognized. No parades, no medal ceremonies, no newspaper articles. They do the job because it needs doing, and they accept that history will forget them because forgetting them keeps other people safe." Rebecca remained quiet during this explanation, but something in her posture suggested she was hearing her own story told by someone who understood its weight. The 158th Echo Response Group was one of those units, Reynolds continued. For 7 years, they ran interference operations in 3 theaters of conflict. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, they saved more American lives than most entire divisions. Lieutenant Myers found his voice again, though it cracked slightly. "Sir, how would we have known that?" "You would have known by asking instead of assuming," Reynolds replied. "You would have known by showing basic respect to someone who earned it before you were old enough to tie your own boots." Sergeant Major Williams approached with Rebecca's processed equipment. Everything regulation perfect. Everything properly issued. "Ma'am, you're all set. Is there anything else you need?" "This is plenty, Sergeant Major. Thank you." Reynolds watched the exchange, then turned back to his impromptu classroom. "Gentlemen, I want you to understand something about military service. Rank is responsibility, not privilege. Your bars don't make you better than anyone. They make you accountable for everyone under your command and respectful to those who served before you." He gestured toward Rebecca, who was now shouldering her gear with practiced efficiency. This woman spent 7 years in operations you'll never read about, in places you can't pronounce, doing things that kept you safe enough to attend college and play weekend warrior in ROTC. Her service doesn't need your validation, but it sure as hell deserves your respect. Lieutenant Bradley stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. What we said was completely out of line." "We all make mistakes, Lieutenant," Rebecca replied. "The important thing is learning from them." Her voice held no anger, no vindication, just the quiet authority of someone who'd been tested in ways these young officers couldn't imagine. But there was something else there too, a recognition that they were young, inexperienced, and capable of becoming better soldiers if they learned the right lessons. General Reynolds checked his watch. "I have a meeting with the base commander in 20 minutes. "I have a meeting minutes." This conversation will be part of that discussion. A look directly at each lieutenant in turn. "I suggest you spend the time between now and then thinking about what kind of officers you want to be." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Career trajectories could change based on how this morning's events were reported up the chain of command. But Rebecca stepped forward, addressing Reynolds directly. "General, if I may, these officers made an error in judgment, but they weren't malicious. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." Reynolds studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Slowly, your call, Sergeant. But this conversation isn't over." As he headed for the exit, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor, the depot began to breathe. But the morning's lessons were far from finished, and everyone present knew they'd witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The real reckoning was still ahead. Word travels faster than light on a military base, especially when it involves junior officers learning hard lessons from senior leadership. By 0930, 3 separate phone calls had been made to the base commander's office. 2 informal counseling sessions had been scheduled, and one very uncomfortable conversation was about to begin in Conference Room B of the headquarters building. Rebecca had finished loading her gear and was heading to her truck when her phone buzzed. The number showed Fort Hartwell's main switchboard. "Ms. Torres? This is Captain Jennifer Walsh, aide to Colonel Morrison. The Colonel would like to speak with you this morning, if you're available. About what happened at the depot? Among other things, ma'am. Would 1,000 hours work for you?" Rebecca checked her watch. That gave her 30 minutes to decide whether she wanted to get involved in what was clearly becoming an official matter. Her instinct was to decline. She'd gotten her gear, made her point, and demonstrated enough grace to let the young officers learn from their mistake without destroying their careers. But something about General Reynolds' reaction bothered her. His knowledge of echo response wasn't the kind of information that made it into standard briefings, even at his level. Which meant either he'd been briefed specifically about their operations, or he'd been personally involved in ways that weren't reflected in his official record. "I'll be there," she said. Conference Room B was one of those windowless military spaces designed to make important conversations feel appropriately serious. Fluorescent lights, government-issue furniture, and the kind of acoustic tiles that made every whisper sound like a confession. When Rebecca arrived, she found a gathering that looked more like a court-martial than a casual meeting. Colonel Morrison sat at the head of the table, a career officer with the kind of bearing that suggested he'd earned his position through competence rather than politics. To his right sat General Reynolds, still wearing the expression of someone who took military standards personally. On the left side of the table, The three lieutenants sat rigid in their chairs, looking like they'd spent the morning reconsidering their career choices. "Ms. Torres," Colonel Morrison began, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." She took the chair opposite the lieutenants, noting how they couldn't quite meet her eyes. Whatever conversation had happened before her arrival had clearly been educational. "I'll get straight to the point," Morrison continued. "General Reynolds has briefed me on this morning's incident at the supply depot. He's also shared some classified information about your service record that puts your treatment there in a particularly disturbing light." Rebecca remained quiet, letting the colonel set the tone. "What happened this morning represents a failure of military courtesy, professional judgment, and basic human decency," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "These officers made assumptions about your service based on incomplete information, and then acted on those assumptions in a way that reflects poorly on this installation and the United States Army." Lieutenant Myers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Morrison cut him off. "You've done enough talking for one day." Reynolds leaned forward, addressing Rebecca directly. "What I didn't mention at the depot is that I've been trying to track down former Echo response personnel for a specific reason. There's a training exercise coming up, joint operations between conventional and special operations forces. We need someone with experience in unconventional warfare to help design scenarios that actually prepare our people for what they'll face downrange. The kind of scenarios that can't be found in field manuals," Morrison added. "The kind that require someone who's actually been there." Rebecca considered this. "You're talking about contract work." "I'm talking about passing on knowledge that could save lives," Reynolds replied. "These three officers will deploy within the next 18 months. When they do, they'll be responsible for soldiers who are counting on their judgment and leadership. What happened this morning suggests they need better preparation than they're currently receiving." The implication was clear. The lieutenant's education was far from complete, and Rebecca was being offered the opportunity to be part of that. "Education? What kind of training are we discussing?" she asked. Morrison opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "Urban operations, counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare tactics. The kind of thing Echo Response specialized in, but that doesn't get taught in conventional military schools." Rebecca glanced at the papers, training scenarios, personnel requirements, budget authorizations. This wasn't a token gesture or an attempt to smooth over the morning's incident. This was a legitimate offer for serious work. "There's something else," Reynolds said. "Your unit's operations have been declassified for training purposes. Not for public release, but for internal military education. The lessons learned from Crimson Ridge, Nightfall, and Ghostwalker are now part of the advanced curriculum at the Command and General Staff College." Rebecca looked up from the documents. "Declassified how much?" "Enough to give proper credit where it's due," Morrison replied. "Your unit's contributions to mission success in 3 theaters of operation are now part of the official record. It won't bring back the anonymity, but it does mean the military is finally acknowledging what Echo Response accomplished." For the first time that morning, Rebecca showed genuine emotion. Not vindication or satisfaction, but something deeper: recognition that the work her unit had done, the sacrifices they'd made, the brothers and sisters they'd lost in operations that officially never happened, finally meant something to the institution they'd served. "The training contract is real," Reynolds continued. "But I'll be honest, part of this is personal. What happened this morning was unacceptable, and these officers need to understand what military service actually means before they're responsible for other people's lives." Rebecca looked at the 3 lieutenants, who were clearly wondering if their careers were about to take a very different direction than they planned. "If I take this contract," she said, "it worked directly with me. No special treatment, No easy assignments. They learn the same way everyone learns, by doing it right or doing it over until they get it right. Myers nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am, we understand. Do you? Rebecca asked. Because understanding means accepting that military service isn't about rank or privilege or who salutes whom. It's about being competent enough to bring everyone home alive. Morrison closed the folder. So what do you say, Miss Torres? Are you interested in helping us train the next generation of military leaders? Rebecca looked around the table at the colonel who was offering her real work, at the general who understood what her service had meant, at the three young officers who were about to learn what military leadership actually required. When do we start? She said. The first training session was scheduled for the following Monday at the Forward Operating Base Simulation Complex on the far side of Fort Hartwell. Rebecca arrived at 0500, an hour before the scheduled start time, to inspect the facilities and design scenarios that would test everything the three lieutenants thought they knew about military leadership. The simulation complex was impressive, a miniature city built specifically for urban warfare training, complete with multi-story buildings, underground tunnels, and enough technological sophistication to replicate everything from IED attacks to sniper fire. But Rebecca wasn't interested in the high-tech equipment. She was focused on the fundamentals: decision-making under pressure, leadership when things went wrong, and the kind of judgment that kept soldiers alive. By 0600, she had transformed the training area into something that would challenge every assumption the lieutenants had about military operations. Hidden observers, unexpected variables, and scenario modifications that would test their ability to adapt when their carefully planned missions fell apart. The three officers arrived at exactly 0600, in properly pressed uniforms and with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they'd spent the weekend researching everything they could find about unconventional warfare, which, Rebecca knew, meant they'd learned absolutely nothing useful. Good morning, she said, not bothering with military courtesy. Today we're going to find out what you actually know about leading soldiers in combat. Not what you learned in a classroom, not what you read in a manual, but what you can do when everything goes wrong and people are counting on you to make the right decision. Lieutenant Myers stepped forward, apparently designated as the group's spokesman. Ma'am, we've prepared for today's exercise by studying the training materials and— Stop, Rebecca interrupted. First lesson: combat doesn't wait for you to finish your briefing. Second lesson: preparation means understanding your mission, your resources, and your limitations. Everything else is just paperwork. She gestured toward the simulation complex. Here's your scenario. You're leading a patrol through an urban environment. Your mission is to establish contact with local officials and assess the security situation. You have a squad of soldiers, limited ammunition, and no air support. Questions? Lieutenant Bradley raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what about the enemy situation? Threat assessment? Rules of engagement? What about them? Rebecca replied. In real operations, you work with the information you have, not the information you want. Figure it out as you go. For the next 4 hours, Rebecca put the three officers through scenarios that tested every aspect of military leadership. Not just tactical knowledge, but judgment, adaptability, and the ability to make decisions when lives were on the line. She threw curveballs that no manual could prepare them for: civilian casualties, equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and the kind of moral ambiguity that defined modern warfare. Lieutenant Torres, the one who'd made jokes about her grandfather's attic, found himself trying to negotiate with a hostile crowd while his communications equipment failed and his squad looked to him for guidance. The confidence he'd shown at the supply depot evaporated when faced with actual responsibility. Lieutenant Bradley discovered that his textbook knowledge of urban warfare meant nothing when confronted with scenarios that required improvisation and moral courage. The leadership principles he'd memorized became meaningless when every decision carried life and death consequences. Lieutenant Myers, who'd been so quick to question Rebecca's authorization, learned what it felt like to have his own authority challenged when the veteran sergeants playing his subordinates started questioning his orders. The rank on his uniform meant nothing when his decisions put people at risk. By 1,000 hours, all three officers had failed multiple scenarios, made critical errors in judgment, and discovered that military leadership was significantly more complex than their training had prepared them for. They sat in the debriefing room, sweaty, frustrated, and beginning to understand the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Thoughts? Rebecca asked, settling into her chair with the kind of calm that came from watching people learn hard lessons. "Ma'am," Myers said slowly, "we were completely unprepared for this." "For what? Specifically?" "For the responsibility," Bradley admitted. "In the scenarios when soldiers got hurt because of our decisions. That's not something you could really prepare for in a classroom." Rebecca nodded. "Now you're starting to understand. Military leadership isn't about knowing the right answers. It's about making the best decisions you can with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for the consequences." Lieutenant Torres leaned forward. "Ma'am, in that crowd control scenario, when the situation deteriorated, I froze. I knew what the manual said to do, but when it was actually happening..." "You discovered that real situations don't follow the manual," Rebecca finished. "That's why military units train constantly, why experience matters, and why respect for veterans isn't just courtesy. It's recognition that some knowledge can only be earned through service." The room was quiet for a moment as the implications sank in. "Here's what's going to happen over the next 6 weeks," Rebecca continued. "You're going to train harder than you've ever trained in your lives. You're going to fail, learn from it, and try again. You're going to discover that military service is about much more than rank and authority. It's about competence, integrity, and the willingness to put other people's lives ahead of your own comfort." She stood, gathering her notes. "And by the time we're finished, you're going to understand why assumptions about someone's service record can be dangerous, disrespectful, and completely wrong." The three officers exchanged glances, beginning to realize that their education was just beginning, and that the woman they'd mocked a week earlier was about to teach them lessons they'd carry for the rest of their military careers. "Same time tomorrow," Rebecca said, heading for the door. "And gentlemen, wear boots you can actually run in. You're going to need them." 6 weeks of intensive training had transformed the three lieutenants in ways that textbooks and classroom instruction never could. They moved differently now, less swagger, more purpose. Their questions had evolved from challenging authority to seeking understanding. Most importantly, they'd learned to recognize the difference between confidence and competence. The final exercise was designed to test everything they'd learned. Rebecca had constructed a scenario based loosely on operations she'd actually run with Echo Response, the kind of complex, morally ambiguous mission that required not just tactical knowledge, but judgment, leadership, and the ability to make decisions that would haunt you regardless of their outcome. Intelligence reports indicate a high-value target is meeting with local militia leaders in Building 7. She briefed them in the pre-dawn darkness. "Your mission is to confirm the target's presence and, if possible, apprehend him without civilian casualties. However, the building also contains approximately 30 non-combatants, including women and children." She paused, letting the weight of the scenario settle over them. "Complicating factors. Your communication with higher headquarters has been compromised by enemy jamming. Your extraction helicopter has mechanical problems and is running 30 minutes late. And intelligence just informed you that there may be a secondary target in Building 3. but pursuing both could compromise the primary mission. Lieutenant Myers, now serving as the mission commander, studied the tactical map with the kind of focused intensity he'd never shown in their first meeting. 6 weeks of training had taught him that every decision carried consequences, and those consequences belonged to the leader who made them. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "what are our rules of engagement regarding civilian casualties?" "Same as." "They always are, Lieutenant. Minimize harm to non-combatants while accomplishing the mission. But remember, in the real world, sometimes there are no perfect solutions." The exercise began at 0400. For the next 3 hours, Rebecca watched through monitoring equipment as the 3 officers faced every scenario she'd designed to test their judgment, leadership, and moral courage. Equipment failures, civilian interference, unexpected enemy contact, and the kind of split-second decisions that define combat leadership. Lieutenant Torres found himself choosing between pursuing a fleeing suspect and providing medical aid to a wounded civilian. The Torres who'd made jokes about fake patches 6 weeks earlier would have chosen the tactically correct option without hesitation. The Torres who'd spent 6 weeks learning what military service actually meant agonized over the decision, ultimately choosing to save the civilian and accepting the mission consequences. Lieutenant Bradley faced a situation where following orders would likely result in civilian casualties, while disobeying them might allow enemy forces to escape. The manual had clear guidance about the chain of command, but the manual hadn't prepared him for weighing human lives against mission objectives. His decision to modify the orders, accepting personal responsibility for the consequences, showed a maturity that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. Lieutenant Myers discovered that his authority meant nothing when his subordinates questioned a decision that seemed to put them at unnecessary risk. Instead of pulling rank, he explained his reasoning, listened to their concerns, and modified his plan based on their input. The confidence he'd shown in mocking Rebecca's credentials had been replaced by something far more valuable: the humility to recognize that good leadership meant serving the people under his command. When the exercise ended at 0700, all 3 officers had successfully completed their missions, but more importantly, they'd done so while maintaining their integrity and protecting the people they were responsible for. They sat in the debriefing room, exhausted but different, no longer the cocky junior officers who'd made assumptions about a veteran they didn't understand. "Analysis?" Rebecca asked, settling into her chair. "Ma'am," Myers began, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there 6 weeks earlier. "Every decision we made had consequences beyond the immediate mission. We had to balance tactical objectives with moral responsibilities. And," Rebecca prompted, "and we realized that real military leadership isn't about having the right answers. It's about asking the right questions and accepting responsibility for whatever decision you make," Bradley added. Torres nodded slowly. "Ma'am, in that first scenario where I had to choose between the suspect and the wounded civilian, there was no textbook answer. I had to decide what kind of officer I wanted to be." Rebecca studied them for a moment, seeing not the arrogant young officers who'd mocked or worn uniform, but soldiers who begun to understand what military service actually required. "6 weeks ago, you made assumptions about my service based on incomplete information," she said. "You saw a faded patch you didn't recognize and decided you knew my story. What did you learn from that?" The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. "We learned that respect has to be earned, but it also has to be given," Myers said finally. "We assumed that because we couldn't verify your service, it wasn't legitimate. We never considered that some service isn't meant to be verified. We learned that military leadership is about competence, not credentials," Bradley added. "Your patch was faded because you'd actually used it in places where it mattered." Torres leaned forward. "Ma'am, We learned that mocking someone's service, even if we thought it was fake, said more about our character than theirs. A real military leader doesn't tear down other people to build themselves up. Rebecca nodded slowly. Those are hard lessons to learn, but they're essential ones. In 18 months, you'll deploy with soldiers whose lives will depend on your judgment, your integrity, and your ability to lead when everything goes wrong. The soldiers under your command won't care where you went to school or what your test scores were. They'll care whether you can make decisions that bring them home alive. She stood, gathering her training materials for the last time. Your education isn't finished. It never will be. But you've learned the most important lesson. Military service is about serving something bigger than yourself. And leadership is about taking responsibility for the people who trust you with their lives. The three officers stood as well, but there was something different about their bearing, now less rigid formality, more genuine respect. "Ma'am," Myers said, "thank you for the training, for the lessons, and for giving us a chance to learn from our mistakes instead of just punishing. As you asked for them." Rebecca paused at the door. "Lieutenant, the best leaders are the ones who learn from their mistakes and help others avoid making the same ones. Remember that when you're responsible for other people's development." As she walked out of the training facility for the final time, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that morning at the supply depot. The three officers who questioned her credentials had learned that military service couldn't be measured by the visibility of unit patches or the recognition of sacrifices. They discovered that true military leadership required humility, integrity, and the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. More importantly, they'd learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions, a lesson that would serve them well throughout their military careers and beyond. The education was complete, but the impact would last a lifetime. 3 months later, Rebecca Torres received an invitation that surprised her. Engraved on heavy military stationery, it requested her presence at Fort Hartwell's quarterly awards ceremony. The invitation was signed by Colonel Morrison and included a handwritten note. "Your presence would honor us all." She almost didn't go. Award ceremonies weren't her style, and she'd never been comfortable with public recognition. But something about the formality of the invitation, combined with curiosity about how the 3 lieutenants were progressing, convinced her to attend. The ceremony was held in the base's main auditorium, filled with soldiers in dress uniforms and families proud of their service members' achievements. Rebecca took a seat in the back, wearing the same civilian clothes she'd worn to the supply depot months earlier: pressed slacks, a simple blouse, and the faded field jacket that had started everything. The ceremony proceeded through the usual military formalities: unit commendations, individual achievements, promotion announcements. Rebecca half listened, her attention focused on scanning the crowd for familiar faces. She spotted the 3 lieutenants in the front rows, their dress uniforms impeccable, their bearing noticeably different from the overconfident officers she'd first encountered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Morrison announced from the podium, "our final presentation today is somewhat unusual. It recognizes service that was never meant to be publicly acknowledged, sacrifice that was designed to remain anonymous, and contributions to our nation's security that have only recently been declassified for recognition." Rebecca felt a chill of apprehension. This wasn't what she'd expected. For 7 years, a specialized unit known as the 158th Echo Response Group conducted operations in 3 theaters of conflict. These operations were classified at the highest levels, with personnel operating under cover designations that provided complete deniability. Their missions saved countless American lives, but their service was never publicly recognized because recognition would have compromised ongoing operations. Morrison paused, scanning the audience. Recent declassification of certain operational Records has allowed the Department of Defense to acknowledge the contributions of Echo Response personnel. Today, we have the honor of recognizing one of those veterans. Rebecca realized she was holding her breath. Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres, United States Army, served with distinction in Operation Nightfall, Operation Ghostwalker, and the classified mission designated Crimson Ridge. Her unit's actions directly contributed to the successful extraction of American personnel under hostile fire and the preservation of mission-critical intelligence assets. The colonel's voice carried across the silent auditorium. Sergeant Torres' service exemplifies the highest traditions of military dedication, service without recognition, sacrifice without acknowledgement, and commitment to mission success regardless of personal cost. Rebecca felt every eye in the auditorium turned toward her. This wasn't what she'd signed up for, wasn't what she wanted, but she understood the message Morrison was sending. Some service deserved recognition, even if that recognition came years after the fact. Sergeant Torres, would you please join me on stage? The walk down the auditorium aisle felt like the longest movement of her military career. Soldiers stood as she passed, not because protocol required it, but because they understood they were witnessing something significant. At the podium, Morrison waited with General Reynolds and a presentation case that contained medals she'd never expected to receive. By order of the Department of Defense and recommendation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Morrison announced, Sergeant First Class Rebecca Torres is awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat operations, the Meritorious Service Medal for exceptional performance in classified operations, and the Combat Action Badge in recognition of direct engagement with enemy forces. As the medals were pinned to her jacket, Rebecca caught sight of the three lieutenants in the front row. Myers, Bradley, and Torres stood at attention, but their faces showed something beyond military courtesy, genuine respect, and understanding of what these awards represented. But Morrison wasn't finished. There's one more presentation, he said, opening a second case. The Distinguished Service Cross is awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. On October 15, 2011, during Operation Crimson Ridge, Sergeant Torres voluntarily exposed herself to enemy fire to provide covering positions for wounded American personnel, enabling the successful extraction of 57 soldiers who would not have survived without her actions. The Distinguished Service Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. Rebecca had never expected to see one, much less receive one. As the medal was pinned to her jacket, the auditorium erupted in applause, not the polite acknowledgement typical of military ceremonies, but genuine appreciation from people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. When the ceremony concluded, Rebecca found herself surrounded by soldiers wanting to shake her hand, thank her for her service, and hear stories about operations they'd only read about in classified briefings. But the encounter that meant the most came from three young officers who approached with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or demanded, only earned. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Myers said, "we wanted to thank you again, not just for the training, but for teaching us what military service actually means." "What we said that day at the supply depot," Lieutenant Bradley added, "we'll never forget how wrong we were or how much we learned from it." Lieutenant Torres nodded. "Ma'am, you could have ended our careers that morning. Instead, you helped us become better officers. We deploy next month, and we're ready because of what you taught us." Rebecca studied their faces, seeing the officers. "They've become rather than the ones they've been. Remember what you learned," she said simply. "Pass it on to the soldiers under your command. And never make assumptions about someone's service. Ask questions instead." As the three officers moved away to rejoin their families, General Reynolds approached with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that suggested he'd orchestrated more of the day's events than anyone realized. How does it feel to finally get the recognition you earned? He asked. Rebecca looked down at the medals on her jacket, then back at the auditorium where soldiers were still talking about the ceremony. Unexpected, she said honestly. I never served for recognition. I know, Reynolds replied. That's exactly why you deserved it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the crowd disperse. Families gathered around their soldiers. Children pointed excitedly at dress uniforms, and the normal chaos of military life resumed. You know, Reynolds said, we could use someone with your experience on a permanent basis. The Army is finally acknowledging that unconventional warfare requires unconventional expertise. Rebecca considered this, fingering the fabric of her old field jacket. The patch was still faded, still barely visible, but it no longer felt like a relic from forgotten operations. It felt like a reminder of service that mattered, sacrifices that counted, and lessons that needed to be passed on. Let me think about it, she said. But as she walked out of the auditorium, medals glinting on her chest and respect earned through years of anonymous service finally acknowledged, Rebecca Torres knew her military story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. Behind her, the three lieutenants watched her go with the kind of understanding that would stay with them throughout their careers. They'd learned that military service couldn't be measured by the visibility of achievements or the publicity of sacrifices. They discovered that true military leadership required humility, integrity, and the courage to serve something bigger than themselves. Most importantly, they'd learned never to make assumptions about someone's service, because the most important stories were often the ones that were never meant to be told. The faded patch had finally received the recognition it deserved, but more importantly, the lessons it represented would continue to shape military leaders for years to come. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.